So many years ago, I was in a national park researching another periphery topic, and I noticed some people follow me around the park. And usually when I go to a national park, if I want to talk to people, it's not normal for me to go to the employees because they usually won't talk. So you go to the people that are working in the restaurants, or you go to the people working at different contract locations, and they are employed by the Park Service. And at the end of the day, I went back to my cabin off the premises at the park. I was there a few hours, get a knock on the door, and a couple of plainclothes people were standing there, and they said that they were National Park Rangers off duty. They knew who I was. They saw me at the park, and they wanted to talk to me about something if I wouldn't mind. So they came into the room, and they ended up laying out this story that they had worked at a series of parks during their career. And while at those parks, they saw an inordinate amount of people disappear. And that didn't bother them so much at one park until they started to go to other parks and see the same sort of mentality from the Park Service, where at the beginning of the search for the people, there was a lot of publicity. Then after 5, 7, 8 days, there's absolutely nothing more to be heard about that case. And there's very little to no follow-up. And they got concerned because the numbers were high, and they never heard anything more about the people that disappeared. And they thought that there was something there, but they didn't know who to turn to. So it fell into my hands.
And what did you think when they told you about this?
Well, I was somebody who was in the outdoors a lot in my life, and you would occasionally hear about people who disappeared, and I truthfully, like everybody else in the world, would slack it off to poor judgment, accidental injury, maybe a mountain lion took them down, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't give it much thought until I started to think about it. I didn't sleep too good that night. The next morning I got up and I called a couple of law enforcement friends, and I said, hey, kind of run this for me, these names and these locations, because I can't get to a computer, and just see how many people come out associated with these locations. And about half an hour later, they called me back and said, oh my gosh, you won't believe it, but there's a lot here. And then there isn't much information other than that first 4 or 5 days that they disappeared. So right away, there seemed to be a valid concern, and it was worth looking into.
Okay, and when was that approximately?
About 4 years ago.
Okay, and the amount of information you have in these books, this must have been a massive job to start collecting these.
It took a lot of work. It took a lot of patience, a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, a lot of political plays by the Park Service to kind of keep the information from me. It was nerve-wracking.
It
still is. I should say it still is nerve-wracking because I'm still facing the same issues.
And why would the Park Service is difficult about some of this?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. They don't live by the rules of the government. That's obvious because, according to the Freedom of Information Act, we're supposed to be entitled to this information. And even though a case is classified as a missing persons case, there's no suspects. The case hasn't been looked at in 25 years. No one's touched the case. I get told, no, you're never going to see that case. And I'm talking about the Stacy Arras case out of Yosemite.
Do you want to tell people a little about that one?
Sure. Stacy was 14 years old, went with her dad and 6 other people, and they went on horseback into the backcountry of Yosemite. And they rode for 4 or 5 hours the first day, and they come to these cabins way out in the middle of the woods. It's a beautiful location. They get off their horses, and one of the ranch hands that was with them took the horses. Stacy and her dad went to one of the cabins. She changed, freshened up, and she told her dad she was going to walk about 200 feet away and go to this rock and take pictures of the vista over this lake that they were located at. And a 72-year-old man walked out there with her. Everybody saw them both sit down. She then told the man that she was going to walk down this granite hillside to the lake and take some pictures down to the lake and be right back. Everyone saw the other man never moved. He sat on the rock, and Stacy went down to the lakeside into this clump of trees, and that was the last time anybody ever saw her. And there was a huge, huge search. And her relatives went to the search location. I ended up talking to one of her uncles, and he said there were hundreds and hundreds of people there for almost 2 weeks. The only thing they ever found of her was a lens cap to her camera inside that tree line next to the lake. So what got me on that case originally is I used to live in California. She was from Saratoga, and I lived in Los Gatos at the time, and it's the city right next to Saratoga. And so I took a little interest in it, and first FOIA, sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Park Service, got denied. I appealed it, got denied. And then I got a call from what's called a special agent. They're detectives inside the Park Service that do the follow-up on these cases. And I get a call from this individual and asking why I wanted that case. Well, I know the law and I know the way FOIA works, and no governmental agency can ask you that question leading to a reason why they will or will not give it to you. It's against the FOIA rules. Trying to be polite, I said, well, why does that matter? And I said, I'm a retired law enforcement guy. All I do is I want this missing persons case. And he says, well, we need to know why. And I said, well, can I ask you one question? Is this a missing persons case or is it a criminal investigation? He said, it's a missing persons case. So then I said, well, are there any suspects that you're investigating, or has anybody looked at this case in the last 20 years? No and no. I said, well, what's the rationale on not giving this case to us? Because I have 20 other cases that the National Park Service has given under almost identical circumstances, but why not give up this case? And he goes, I can only tell you that you will never see this case. That's almost a direct quote.
Wow. And so you have gotten some things from them.
Absolutely. Much of it is redacted. Things are missing from it. There's a famous case out of Great Smoky Mountain National Park where a boy named Dennis Martin disappeared. And without getting into the specifics, the most important part of that case had to do with a family making an observation of something like a person or a biped carrying something on its shoulder. And that's the most important part of the case, because then they see this thing leave, and it was right after Dennis disappeared. And they sent me the package on the Dennis Martin case, and there's nothing in that case file about the Park Service special agent or the FBI agent interviewing that family about what they saw. And I guarantee that's the most important part of the case. I sent them back a FOIA request, a secondary request saying, this wasn't in the case file, it must have been overlooked, could you please send it to me? They said, no, it wasn't overlooked, it doesn't exist.
Wow. Actually, Dennis Martin was one of the ones I wanted to talk to you about. If you want to go into that one a little more, because the information during the search is kind of interesting there.
Absolutely. Dennis, 6-year-old boy, on June 14th, 1969, he was up on an area called Spence Field. It's kind of the upper reaches, the higher reaches of the park. You have to hike in a couple miles to this location, and it's a giant field surrounded by thick woods. And he, his dad, his brother, and his grandpa were up there for, I think it was Father's Day weekend, and they were camping. Well, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the brothers are all running around, and his dad and his grandpa are sitting in chairs. And as the boys are running around, this other family walks up to them. And this is one of the things that happens in these cases that'll just blow you away. And that's coincidences that happen, and they're surreal. This other family comes up and says, hi there, do you mind if our boys play together? And they had a couple of kids too. Mr. Martin goes, no, that'd be good. Well, why don't you guys join us? And so the man leans over and goes, okay, my name's so-and-so Martin. He had the exact same last name as the Martins. So the boys start to play, and they decide that they're going to play hide and seek. And Mr. Martin, he is a super smart man and very attentive. And he watches his boy go behind a bush right on the fringe of this thick woods, hiding from in this game they're playing. After everybody comes out, Dennis doesn't come out. And he's watching and he's watching. He doesn't wait very long, and he says he walks over to that bush, and Dennis wasn't there. Well, right through the middle of Spence Field is the Appalachian Trail. And Mr. Martin took off on a dead run for 2 miles down that trail. He was in excellent shape. And he told his dad, he goes, Dennis isn't here. And everyone starts looking. He took off on a dead run, didn't find anything, came back. His dad turned around, ran down to the Park Service headquarters. Within an hour, there were 35 rangers there. Now, the other strange thing about this, within a half an hour after Dennis disappeared, it started to rain at the park. And it rained almost nonstop for 5 days. Now, that in itself may not mean a lot, but when you start to look at the totality of the cases we look at, inclement weather that hits an area right after a search happens an unusual amount of time. So as Dennis disappears, again, they're kind of up on this plateau, a family walks up to a ranger down at the lower levels of the park and says, hey, where can we go to see bears? And he says, you can go to this area called Rowan's Creek. So they drive up into this area, and it's a dad, a mom, and 2 kids. And this is another weird thing. Their last name is called the Key, K-E-Y family. And I'm telling you, this is the key part of the entire disappearance. As the Key family walks up Rowan's Creek, they get up a little bit, and their 9-year-old son goes, hey, Dad, look at the bear up there on the hill. And the dad looks up there and goes, I don't think that's a bear. It almost looks like a man. And this is in the Knoxville newspaper, the biggest newspaper of the time. And they see this, and they watch it. And just before they saw it, they heard the loudest blood-curdling scream that they'd ever heard in their life come down through that valley. And they said it was louder than any of them could have screamed.
Oh.
Then they see this biped on the hill, and they don't think that much about it, but they know it wasn't a bear. And the family comes down, and they didn't see a bear, and they get in their car and they drive away. Well, the next day in the Knoxville newspaper, and they see this about 45 minutes after Dennis disappears. It starts to rain on them. They get in their car and they go home. Next day, front page is Dennis is missing. And they said, wow, we were just below where he was. We saw this. It might be related. So, and they read that an FBI agent has been assigned at this early stage to the Dennis Martin disappearance. So they call the FBI, and they can't find the right person. They call the Park Service, and a special agent calls them and says, yeah, okay, we'll call you right back. Within a few minutes, the FBI agent calls them back and says, yeah, we understand what you saw. And the Key family says, okay, we'll meet you at that location and explain what we saw, where we were, etc., which makes total sense. That's what you want to see as an investigator, understand their viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
FBI agent says, no, don't come to the park. We'll come to you, or we'll meet you halfway, which is very strange. Until you understand. Dennis Martin's dad had a member of Park Service with him all the time. And he had told them that any valuable lead, anything you get on my son, I want to be the first person to know. And he had that agreement with the Park Service. It appeared from the very beginning that they were trying to withhold this information from him. And the FBI agent, the special agent from the Park Service goes, meets with this family, takes a statement. Well, the rumor mill, a couple days later, starts to flow through the search camp, and by now there's over 1,000 people there. And a newspaper writer from the Knoxville Times picks up on this and starts asking around. And one of the National Park Service rangers says, yeah, we did get a call like that, and the special agent and the FBI agent went out on it, but we don't know what happened. No one's talking about it. Newspaper guy starts digging harder and harder, and finally he gets the truth out of the special agent saying what happened. So then the writer goes to Mr. Martin and goes, yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Mr. Martin goes, no one's told me about it. Finally, he starts to hear about it 3-4 days later. And Mr. Martin gets mad because it's obvious it's being controlled and concealed. And so he has a big fit. And he goes to one of the trackers for the Park Service, a guy named Dwight McCullar, and he explains to him the timing and the location. And McCullar talks to the people, and the special agent and the FBI agent said, hey, we're not going to even put any emphasis on this because the timing and the locations don't make any sense. McCullar goes to Mr. Martin and goes, no, they're not telling the truth. The timing and the locations could easily be done, In fact, we will walk it this afternoon to prove it could be done. McCullar and Mr. Martin walk it, and they do it in less time than the time span that existed. So moving backwards a little bit, the first couple days of this search, they had hundreds and hundreds, eventually thousands. And then out of the blue show up the Green Berets. And they come in helicopters, and they bring their own communication system. And McCullar, we interviewed him, and he says it was very strange. He says nobody took responsibility as to who requested them, even though they were there's rumors out there that they were training in the area. Nothing could be confirmed like that. Second of all, McCullar said that one of the supervisors of the park rangers went to the Green Beret and says, okay, why don't we put 2 or 3 of your guys with one of our guys since we know the area and you guys won't get lost, and we'll kind of work in this team effort like this. Green Beret said, no, we're going to work alone. They wouldn't use their communication system, wouldn't get on their walkie-talkies. They put up their own command center, their own communication system, and they were there for, I believe, 4 or 5 days searching. Nobody ever knew what they were searching for other than Dennis, but they wouldn't say. They wouldn't say what their command was. They wouldn't say how long they'd be there. Nothing. Now, under the Freedom of Information Act, you can request orders on different units within the military. We did this 3 times on the Green Berets on this incident. 3 times. We didn't get denied. We didn't even get a response. They wouldn't even reply to the request.
That's bizarre. The Green Berets, I believe you say in your book, they don't search for people, do they?
So that's interesting. I've been on a few radio shows in the past, and I always have asked that if there are any retired Green Berets, send me an email, get a hold of me, and kind of explain the protocol on when they're dispatched and what they do. At this point, I have 3 different responses from families. It's never the Green Beret. It's always the families of them that respond, and I think it's their way not to violate their secrecy oath.
Right.
And the families all said, each one of them said independently, hey, my dad or my uncle said that the Green Berets would never, ever search for a missing person.
Huh. Which means that either they're lying or they were there for some other reason that may be connected to the disappearance.
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know.
One of the things I do like in your books is at no point do you speculate to what's going on. You relate the data to people. You don't go off on any tangents or any wild speculation or even grounded speculation at all. You simply point out the facts in all 3 books. And I'm assuming that was very intentional.
That was a purposeful act, correct.
How long did it take you to compile, like, the first 2 books from the time you started till you actually got them published?
Boy, that was 2.5, almost 3 years.
Wow. And the new one about the same, or no, it couldn't have been?
No, that one came together a lot quicker, and a lot of it had to do that the first 2 books that came out were so big already, we couldn't put a lot of the information that we had in there. So we withheld it. If we were going to do another book, we'd put it in that book, and then other information just flowed easily and could be quickly identified as factual, so it made it in the book as well.
And you said that Texas and Florida have so many cases that they're not even really included. You included a few in the new book, but the first 2 books, you just left them out completely.
The reality of that is there are so many disappearances of people in those 2 states that it's overwhelming. I mean, it's more than almost any other state in the union. And so when you get all of those cases in front of you, you start to think, wow, this must be a serious issue. But then when you get into the minutia of each case, you realize that they don't fit the elements that we have in the other disappearances, thus we're not going to count them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's one of the questions I have is what were the things that you used to determine which cases fit and which ones didn't? There were definitely patterns that followed these cases. And if you want to get into that a little bit, plus anything else that you were looking for specifically to determine what you were going to include and what you were not going to include.
You know, you can't really put up parameters until you look at the totality of, say, a couple thousand cases.
Right.
Then you got to go back through the cases and drag the ones out that meet it. That's what took all the time. And realistically, we weren't looking for these kind of things. We were just seeing if they all fit within the national parks, or, was there something outside? Is there some other parallel element here? And after reading, thousands of cases, kind of the list that came from that is, depending on where in the country the person disappears, these elements are important. Number one is berry bushes or people picking berries.
Which is really weird.
Yeah. And you could even put slash mushrooms with that now.
Okay.
The other thing is swamps. And people who first hear of this tend to try to rationalize it away and say, well, these could be drownings, these could be suicides, these could be animal attacks. Well, those three things we eliminate if there's any chance of any of those being involved. So you can wipe that slate clean. But swamps, people have found little kids are found in the middle of swamps. They're in areas where you and me would have a difficult time getting to, and it's odd. The other thing being is that there's an abnormal amount of young people and children with disabilities that disappear. On that opposite end of the intellectual spectrum, there's a lot of highly, highly educated intellectuals that have disappeared. Canines, so the search and rescue people bring a canine up to search. Sometimes the dog walks in circles, laid down, doesn't want to search. And it's hard to tell if they don't want to search or they can't pick up a scent, but the behavior is unusual and it's pretty consistent that they can't pick up that scent. Many of the people, when they are found, if they are ever found, are found near creeks and rivers. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of weird, and what a lot of people have written and told me and said, well, that's one of the places where if you ever wanted to find tracks, you would never find any, which is true. Well, I would say probably 90% of the people that are found either won't talk about what happened to them, can't remember what happened to them, don't have the ability to talk because they're disabled, or are too young to speak. Many of the people are missing clothing or shoes or a shoe. Disappearances, a large percentage occur in the late afternoon or early evening, and bad weather is associated with the disappearances. And another very odd characteristic is the missing, if they are found, they're found in an area that's been previously searched.
Which implies that they weren't there previously.
Correct.
Obviously, since it had been searched, but that does make it all the odder.
It does.
Also, the inclement weather makes it kind of odd, too, because it's a weird thing to have someone go missing and so often, fill these patterns followed by bad weather. Like, what connection could the weather possibly have to someone going missing?
Well, I freely talk about what people tell me or what they write, and a lot of people have stated, well, there's a lot of animals and there's fish, there's a lot of wildlife that their behavior is attached to weather. If you're a fisherman, you know that the fish bite when a storm's coming in.
Interesting.
Or while the storm is there. So,
which is definitely valuable information, but at the same time, none of these disappearances fit animal attacks.
No. None of them do.
In the end, these just become boggling, is what they become. When you go through these three books, every time you think, well, maybe it's, and then you get to another case, and you're like, no, that doesn't work at all. And I'm sure you felt that way a lot of times trying to make any sense out of this.
You know what? The guys that I work with, we talk about it almost every other day.
And, okay, so let's get into one of these other cases here. One of the one that wasn't extremely weird, but I thought was a good example of things that happened to people was the Corey Kelly case that you have in the Eastern U.S. book.
Very odd case. So Corey, this is in northern Minnesota, a place called the Red Lakes Wilderness. He was an outdoorsman, grew up in that area. This is an area just north of Bemidji, kind of northeast. 38 years old. On October 16th, 2006, he's with a buddy, and they're going to go camping, and they're going to go grouse hunting. And this area, I've been in this area unbelievably, and it's super, super tough to get through because a lot of bogs, a lot of swamps, just rough country, but a lot of wildlife, a lot of deer and such. So as they get there, they kind of set up camp, and his buddy says, hey, you know what, I forgot some gas for the camp stove, etc. Let me drive into town. I'll be back in about 45 minutes. You can finish setting up and maybe get some hunting in. I'm going to leave my dog with you, and you guys can just kind of hang out. Corey says, sure. Buddy takes off. Corey obviously decided to go hunting, takes the dog with him, and these guys come prepared. They were dressed for inclement weather. He had everything he'd need to survive bad weather. They knew what the weather was going to be like, et cetera, et cetera. His buddy returns that night, and Corey isn't there. And he honks the horn, leaves his headlight on. Corey doesn't come back. So he does this all night, and finally in the morning he decides, I better get some help. So a 2-week search goes on, and it's intensive. And about 14 miles from the campsite, they found Corey's overalls, his socks, his sweatshirt, his lighter, and some cigarettes laying spread out on a trail. And they searched for another 4 or 5 days. They found nothing. And bad weather started to move in, and it was raining off and on during this time, and finally the sheriff for that area called the search off. And then they started the search again after the snow started to clear, and it was April 28th. And about 16 miles from where their camp was, and about 50 feet off the trail inside of some giant reeds, they find Corey's body with the aid of a helicopter. They fly over it, and they see him laying there naked. And they land, they recover the body, and I got a copy of the sheriff's report on this. And while as odd as this sounds to you and me and everyone else in the world, the sheriff thought that he couldn't find any illegal or unlawful behavior, and that was the end of the case. And what I tell people about this is that this is an example of something that can't be explained, yet law enforcement can't reconcile it but doesn't want anything to do with it. Because Corey, I should say one more thing, that about 4 or 5 days into the search, the dog came back to the camp. And what they did is they tested the stools of the dog, and they found out that the dog had eaten deer and was in almost excellent health. But, that Corey was an outdoorsman, knew how to hunt, knew the area well, blah, blah, blah. And
didn't he make it to that point like in an almost record amount of time?
Well, that was the thing. They said that those overalls and socks, etc., had been seen the next day by other people along that trail. So what they said is that Corey made it 14 miles in less than 12 hours through this country. His mom made a couple statements saying she doesn't believe that he made it that far in that amount of time. She didn't believe that what happened to him was normal. Something else happened, and it was kind of just shuffled away.
A lot of these disappearances that you've discovered, they happen in clusters of disappearances that span sometimes like a century of time. And you found them, especially like in the Smoky Mountain Park, which has a lot of really weird ones, or up by Crater Lake in Yosemite. The fact that they're clusters at all just seems really bizarre and makes you think that it's a kind of a repeat offender type of thing. But at the same time, the time frame makes it very hard to put that into place.
One of the things, I was on a show right after the books came out, and they hadn't been dispersed much. And one of the things that people came up with, and they said, well, it's obvious, is there's some kind of serial killer in the parks. And I said, well, I don't want to talk bad about the Park Service. I definitely don't want to talk good about them, but I don't think that's a reality. Because if you look at the locations where a lot of these adults have disappeared, it's not rational to believe that somebody could come up to you here in the middle of nowhere, tens of miles inside of a park or a U.S. forest, and take you away in the manner that these people sometimes just disappear when they're 4 or 5 feet behind their parents or behind their friends and vanish. And then when you take into the other elements that canines can't track them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there's something else at play. And the other thing is that people have to remember that in national parks now, there's a large percentage of people that are carrying guns because you can now in national parks. So not only that, but if somebody's going to take you in a mountain area, there's a good chance you are armed. So the quickness, the speed, the stealthiness, the inability for canines to track, the inability of trackers to find tracks, all of those things come into play, and it doesn't make sense that it would be a human predator.
Now, some of the people you find in these cases are never found, I should say. Some of these people are never found. Some of them are found dead, and a few of them have been found alive. Have you been able to talk to anyone that has been recovered from one of these situations?
So that would be a gold mine, and we always talked about that. And when we first started it, we decided that it would probably be important to understand the politics of missing people. And we got a hold of a couple of missing people organizations, and we explained what we were on the path of and tried to understand the do's and don'ts. And both organizations said that you got to be very careful approaching people that have been victims like that. And reason being is that if you approach them and you get them to talk and they tell you a story, and then you write about that story and they see that you've written about it and they see that you've publicized it and garnered some monetary value, they're going to feel like they've been victimized again, and that will give your organization bad publicity. So we made a determination early on that if one of those victims contacts us, absolutely we'll be all over this. We'll do everything we can to get the story, put them through reverse hypnosis, whatever it takes. But we aren't going to be the ones that are going to go out and put our foot forward and try to drag them into something that may make them uncomfortable.
Has anyone ever accused you of taking advantage of these people just by writing about them?
Oh, no.
No, good. And you've worked with missing people organizations as well, like you currently are doing so, right?
Yes.
And we should actually tell people where they can find more information on this. This is the Can-Am Missing site, right?
Right.
And what can people find there?
So we have current information about unusual cases that are ongoing. We have some areas in there that some readers have gone out and done phenomenal work for us in the field, photographing locations where some of these people have disappeared, and some of the photos and the videos are on that site, and they're unreal. You get a true feeling of what the location's like.
Okay. And do you have updates to cases on there as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. And how can people help with this?
Well, part of the rationale behind this is to get people educated. And one of the things is when people say, well, Dave, what can we do to avoid being victimized like this? And what I tell them is, number one, never, ever hike in the woods alone. Number two, carry a personal transponder with you wherever you go in the woods. And what that is, it costs anywhere from, say, $80 to $400. The battery operated if you're ever lost. It's like an EPIRB device on a boat. It sends a signal up to a satellite. Satellite goes to the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. They're the ones that monitor for all the continental U.S. and Canada. They see that there's an emergency alert. They find out where it is. They find the search and rescue team and the sheriff for that area. They call them, and they start a search going right to that location. And it's usually within 20 feet that they could locate where that transponding signal is coming from. So I would say, don't ever walk alone. Carry a personal transponder. And then the last thing, and some people may not like this, I would say carry a firearm. And the reason for that is that I have never found a case where someone was carrying a firearm and a personal transponder together. It may just be an anomaly, but I've never found it.
And have been a lot of cases where people have had firearms and they haven't been fired, and they've just disappeared.
Oh, and there's been cases where the firearm's been fired, and they found them, they found the gun, and person was dead, or they find the gun broken up into pieces and the person's gone. There's been some very strange cases involving hunters where they've disappeared.
And I want to say you had one case in the books where someone did have a transponder on them.
Yes, out of Yosemite, an individual was just hiking, and for some reason or another, and I have no idea how this happened, bad weather came in, thunderstorm. This guy walks to a peak, a granite peak where it isn't the area to go. Any hiker as experienced as this man would have known better. He walks to the top of that peak, and somehow or another, he fell or whatever, ended up down in a crevasse, dead, with his transponder going off. The transponder apparently was activated when he was on top of that peak because they got a signal. When he went down inside the crags and he apparently died, they lost the signal, and on flyovers, one of the planes flew right over that crag, and the signal could only go straight up, and they hit it, and it was probably 1 in a million that they found him. But he died under very strange circumstances.
So, what time frame? I mean, you got cases that have happened just very recently. How far back? What do you think the oldest case you have in these books is? I know you have some from the late 1800s.
I think we have a case that goes back to 1850, 1860.
Yeah. And in all that time, I mean, there's been a lot of books out on strange disappearances and stuff. There was a good one called Into Thin Air that came out, I think, in the 70s. And some of these cases have actually made it into some of those books I've noticed, because I've read a few of them, and no one has picked up these patterns. Like, no one has picked up that this is a bigger phenomenon. They might say, oh, a whole bunch of people have disappeared in this one location, but they don't realize that that is something that is happening across the country, across Canada, and possibly the world. The first two books, you really just deal with U.S. and Canada, and the third one, you start dealing with cases around the world, and that's a little bit more difficult for you, isn't it?
It is, and it's slowly getting easier as the books get distributed further and further, and I can tell you in the last 6 months that we've gotten a lot more cases from other parts of the world that tend to definitely place this in the worldwide phenomena issue.
There's, I don't know how to ask this. You have, obviously, children disappearing. You have full-size adults disappearing. And even though there's patterns and similarities, is it possible there's more than one thing going on?
Oh, I would say that's probably true. Because I don't think that, I mean, we're tracking a little over 600 cases now, and I would still say that it's just a drop in the bucket compared to what's probably occurred in the last 150 years, 200 years, if we could find documentation going back that far. But to think it's just one issue, I think would be an ego-centered answer. I don't think that anybody at this point could say, oh yeah, it's definitely this, or it's definitely that, or it's only two things. I'm with you that I think it could be a multitude of issues.
One of the things that you point out in the book is a lot of these places where people disappear also have sort of evil place names, like Devil's Peak and things like that. Do you think that could be a consequence of this phenomena dating back to the time where those were named and probably before into like Indian legends and such?
Well, normally locations on topographic maps get names for a reason. Mm-hmm. And those reasons are sometimes hard to understand or track down. But when you get a lot of people disappearing around named locations like Devil's Mountain or Twin Devil Peaks or Hell's Canyon or whatever it might be, that just brings a bad connotation to you. I mean, that was one of the issues that came out pretty early in the research when we said, this is strange, look at this. And you don't really know what to make of it other than there is that parallel.
Why do you think there's so few cases in the middle of the country and so many are centered along the east and west coast? Is that something where you just there aren't as many national parks, or have you not researched that area as much, or do you think there aren't as many cases?
That's a great question. And don't have a lot of answers for that, but I can tell you that there is this swath kind of right down the middle of the U.S. vertically that doesn't have many cases at all. And if you look at the dispersal of the cases in other areas of the state, they tend to be, the vast majority tend to be in forested areas where there's a lot of cover. That's not to say that deserts don't play into it, because we have cases in New Mexico and Arizona where kids are found tens of miles away from the point that they were last seen, defying any logical explanation that the kid could travel that far, yet they're found distances away in elevation and height that doesn't make sense in New Mexico and Arizona. So
Now, one of the other common things is boulder fields that you find in some of these cases. Obviously, not everywhere has boulder fields, but it is something that seems to pop up a lot. And there are some Native American legends about boulder fields, and you point one out from Iceland about boulders.
yeah, very strange is that like probably right after the first two books came out, somebody sent us this link about Icelandic legend and their belief that spirits live in these rocks. And you think, well, that's crazy. But the reason they sent me the link is because I talked about people disappearing around granite and around boulder fields. And they said, you ought to look into this. And what there was is somebody made a documentary about it, and they believe in it so much that if there's a giant boulder in the path of a road, the road will go around the boulder. They're not going to move it. They're not going to blow it up. They're going to go around it. That's how respectful they are.
Wow.
And there's a series of other things about beliefs in other parts of the world that tend to wake you up to the point that, wow, this really may be something. We didn't just fantasize this, but this is really something that's been experienced in other parts of the world as well.
Well, I know there's I believe a Cherokee legend of the, see if I can pronounce this, Yungwi Justi, or something like that, who is supposed to live in crags and rocks and rose patches, basically, and scrub bloods, and they're supposed to lure travelers off the path and steal children and abduct them from their homes and stuff.
Well, when you talk about rose patches, thorny patches, briar patches, that's another thing that's in the book,
yeah,
where a lot of kids are found.
Which seems like it's probably more than a coincidence that these tales talk of this stuff, and this is part of the pattern you're finding.
Right. Exactly.
So let's get to another one of these cases here. One of the ones that I found really disturbing was the Charles McCullar case from Crater Lake.
Yes, Charles McCullar.
McCullar, okay.
And Charles was a 19-year-old kid kind of traveling across country. He was from Virginia. And he wanted to make it across the U.S. and see a lot of the outdoors. Well, on October 14th, 76, he ended up making his way into Crater Lake National Park. And Crater Lake has a real fascinating history for people that don't know. It's probably one of the most beautiful parks you'll ever go to. It would look like a giant volcano that's filled up with absolutely pristine blue water. It's unreal. There's nothing flowing in, there's nothing flowing out, and it's extremely deep. And the path up to the crater, there's just a couple roads up to it. There's no pollution in it. It's just absolutely gorgeous. So McCullar gets a ride up to the lake, and he was taking pictures of the lake. Well, his dad kept track of him, and they'd talk every other day or so, and his dad didn't hear from him for a while. And they determined that he was at the lake, and that was the last place he was at. Park Service was notified, a search was done. And in October, that point of the year, they had up to 20-foot snowdrifts around the lake. It was an exceptional year, very deep. There's no snowmobiles that are allowed around or in that park. And so everyone thought, well, he must have gotten a ride out, because they can't find any tracks leaving that area. They couldn't find anything to validate him being in the area or falling in the lake, etc. And his dad came out, and he pushed for the FBI to be involved because he didn't believe the explanation the Park Service was giving him was good. He thought something was amiss. His son was too much of a kind of a base-type person to do anything fluky or strange. and he was concerned, but he could never get the Park Service to ask the FBI in, and essentially nothing happened for many months. Summer rolls around about 9-10 months later, and two people are backpacking their way into deep wilderness 14 miles from the lake. And they come across what looks like a skull cap at this one way in, one way out, small little valley with a creek. And they saw a backpack in kind of leaning up this area as well. And they go through the backpack and they find a couple personal items, and they backpack out and they go to the Park Service. Well, through complete luck, I was able to track down one of the rangers that they approached with this property, and I interviewed him at his home. And this individual was a 30-year seasonal park ranger. He went to the Law Enforcement Academy in Virginia for federal law enforcement. During the school year, he taught science at a middle school. So for every year for 30 years, he'd bring his family up to Crater Lake, and they'd stay. And anyhow, this backpacking group brings these items to him, and his name is Marion. And Marion says, Dave, right away I knew what they were, because McCullar's dad had told him that he had in his possession a Volkswagen key that had like a VW insignia on it, and they gave him that key. He goes, okay, I know that we've now found McCullar. So the people drew him a map, and Marion and another park ranger on horseback rode back into the backcountry. And he says, Dave, 30 years of recovering bodies and seeing strange things in the wilderness, you've just come to me with the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life. And what he explained was that he and his partner hiked down into this little valley with this little creek that rolls in one side, rolls out the other. And he said there was a big Douglas fir tree that was laying kind of across the creek and across the valley. And as they walked up towards the tree, they see this skull cap laying in the gravel on the side of the creek, along with little tiny pieces of bone, probably no more than a half an inch in size, spread all around that area. And he says, I walked over to the Douglas fir, and I put my foot up, and I looked on the other side. He says, it's a sight that you'll never forget. But he says, imagine that somebody had their socks on, and they had their blue jeans on, and they unbuttoned their pants, they unzipped their pants, they undid their buckle, and they dropped their pants down to their socks. And he says, there was no bones there. The pants were laying there just as I described. There's one broken tibia, that's the shin bone in the right leg, that was partially protruding out of the pants. And the socks were still there, as though whoever was wearing them at the time, McCullar, died right there. And there were little tiny bones in the socks. And he says, so we looked around, and right away we knew this is wrong. And he said, I quickly made a quick scan to see if anything else was out there that needed to be seen. And he said, then we packed it up, took a few pictures, went right back to headquarters, called the FBI, and asked for an FBI evidence response team to come to the park and work the scene because this was abnormal. Now, one of the things that Marion said that made him concerned was that there was no coat, there was no boots, there was no shirt. All of the things, he says, boots are always found near bodies. He says it's obvious that McCullar's boots weren't there when he died. And he says boots will last forever because of the soles and things. They can last up to 40, 50, even 100 years later he's found boots. And that's how he's identified a death scene. And he says, I knew something weird was going on when we didn't find the boots. They went through the backpack, and he also had a knife and a camera that weren't there as well. And the FBI came out, and they worked the scene for 3 days. So I made a Freedom of Information Act against the FBI for this report. And their initial response was that they wouldn't give the report because they didn't want to violate the privacy of Charles McCullar. After 4 letters saying, guys, this is a death scene investigation. Mr. McCullar's dead. I want the report on the crime scene information. Finally, the 4th time, I guess they got mad. They sent me the report. It was so redacted and blacked out, it was worthless. Marion's the one that really put the color into what happened on this case. And he says, Dave, obviously Charles McCullar got to that location in the middle of winter, and nobody knows how. Because he said there's no way somebody could walk into that area from where he was located. There was no snowmobile, there was no snowshoe tracks, there was nothing going back there. How he got there? Says Dave, I'll go to my grave not knowing what happened.
Yeah, and that's one of the creepier ones that you relay in this book, for so many reasons, obviously. And where are the rest of the bones?
Well, that was another thing that bothered Marion. He says, usually when you find a skull, you usually find the lower jaw, the mandible, things like that. And he says, well, you didn't find any of that. And he said, whatever bones that were left behind were just infinitesimal in size, and the only bone of any size that he found was this tibia bone. But he says the hip bone, the vertebrae, the shoulders, he goes, nothing. The femur, he goes, I don't know where it all went.
Wow. And that one can be found in your Western New York book, if people want to read the full account. Now, a lot of these people, there's different variations of what people do say when they come back. Or people report when someone is taken. For instance, Ida Mae Curtis from Montana. And she was taken, and she was a young child, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, and she was taken, they actually saw her be taken, right?
2 years old, 1:30 in the afternoon. She was in a tent with some other kids, and they thought that they saw a bear come in and grab her and walk away with her in heavy rain. And she was gone for 24 hours. And she was eventually found in a shelter, what was described as a crude shelter made of some heavy pieces of wood that she couldn't have moved. And when she was eventually brought back, she explained in her own way that she slept with the bear and the bear kept her warm and comforted her. Well, the sheriff for the Kootenai area got so mad at her parents and her for saying that he actually went back 3 times to tell them, quit telling that story. It can never happen. It didn't happen. And don't say it anymore.
And that may not be so much a cover-up as much as disturbed.
I don't know. Nobody could understand how she got to that location either, though, because she had to cross a pretty big creek, and she wasn't wet.
And clearly, bears don't just pick up children and go cuddle with them.
I've talked to bear experts about this because I've heard the same sort of story before, and the bear experts just get perturbed, and they say, hey, a bear's not going to comfort a little kid. A bear's not going to comfort a child. And I've seen cases a bear may eat a child, but, you're going to find bite marks. You're going to find all these things. And by the way, they didn't find any bite marks on any of these victims. So
that's one of the other things. The victims are usually scratched up, but or sometimes scratched up, but they're never usually like, if they're found dead, there's no obvious cause of death. There's not generally any traumatic injuries, bite marks, things like that.
Correct. In fact, in almost all of these cases, I can't remember one off the top of my head where there was ever a coroner's report where there were bite marks on the victim.
And I guess that pretty soundly rules out animals, obviously.
Right.
Now, another one I found very interesting, this was in your third book, is Eric Lewis from Washington. He was a very good mountain climber. And from all the evidence, he untied himself in what was becoming bad weather and disappeared.
That's one of the stranger, well, they're all kind of strange, but this one is just multitude weird. And there is a cluster of disappearances that kind of qualify under all of these factors in Mount Rainier National Park. And Lewis does qualify. He's July 1st, 2010, 57 years old. He climbed and conquered the summit 10 times on Rainier. He'd climbed all over the world on some of the worst and most challenging peaks in the world. He was considered the optimum expert on Rainier. And he was with some friends that were trying to climb and the weather turned a little bit bad. And as his partner up above him was belaying him up, he felt the rope go slack. And he pulled it up, and nobody was on the other end. And he's trying to yell down below, "Hey, Eric, what's going on?" And he wasn't getting an answer. And the behavior wasn't consistent with Eric Lewis. And it was started to snow. It was getting bad. Eventually, his partners turned around, came back down. They never found him. They never found his equipment. It was a completely unknown whodunit. He's never, ever been found.
Did they find anything of him? Like
I don't think
anything
they
he was
did.
carrying?
I don't think they did.
Now, wasn't there a cave shortly down from where he was?
There might have been a small cave, yes.
And one of the theories was maybe he had tried to take shelter in the cave, but obviously he wasn't there.
Right, and once you go into a cave, I mean, you don't come out until the weather's good again, so.
The one of the things that strikes me about some of these cases, I mean, obviously you have the one where the bear came in, where the children saw a bear come in, or what looked like a bear come in and take the child. But there are other cases that almost seem like somebody is lured away. Like they're being baited in some way. Like, why would a mountain climber unhook himself? He wasn't forcibly taken off this rope. So what could he have seen that would have made him untie himself? Other cases you have where someone is looking at something off of a trail, and that's the last time they're seen.
Well, one of the other items that comes up a lot is, especially on the bodies that are found, and I explain this in the book, is many times the coroners can't determine the cause of death, and they say, it's possibly exposure, it's possibly this, it's possibly that. And, that hasn't changed, because today they still come out with causes of death that it appears it's this, it might be that. And somebody wrote to me about 3 months ago and said, "Dave, we read these books, my husband and I, and you know what it reminds me of is that old saying, they were scared to death."
Well, you do have the blood-curdling scream from one of the first stories we talked about here.
And there's a few cases, if you can remember the small kids in a berry patch, the parent hears a scream, the scream's like it's cut off, mid-scream, kids are never found.
I remember a story of someone going to, and it wasn't in your book, it was, I can't remember the name of the guy, but someone was going for water, and he never made it to the well, and when they said they could still hear him like screaming every once in a while very faintly in that area for a short period of time, but they could never find him.
Well, there's a couple stories in the book where people, as an example, there's a gentlemen that lived on a ranch. I think this was in Arkansas, and they've lived there their whole life. And this didn't go into the book because it was a disappearance per se, but because of the behavior that they exhibited and what they experienced kind of fit with what might be happening to some people. And they explained that they were out and they were trying to herd cattle, I think. And they were coming down a ridge line that they'd come down 1,000 times before. And the man explained to us that all of a sudden we looked around and we didn't know where we were. And we yelled, we screamed, we didn't get any responses. We walked around for a couple hours. He had a firearm, so we shot the gun a couple times. And his dad said that he could hear gunfire, but he couldn't understand exactly where they were. And after several hours, these guys said that they eventually recognized the country, the topography, and they knew if they followed this one creek down, they'd eventually walk it back to their house. And he says that was the strangest experience he ever had in his life.
Oh. Yeah, so and you have other cases like that in the book where people suddenly don't know where they are.
Well, yeah, and I thought you were going to talk about this one where two boys were helping their dad. He was cutting some wood, and he said, "Hey, go down and get a bucket of water, each of you." And they went down, and one of the boys spilled his water coming back, so he went back, got a bucket of water, he disappeared. And we're not talking a long distance, we're talking like maybe 70 yards, straight shot from car to creek, and this kid disappears. And he ends up getting found like the 5th day, way in the middle of nowhere. And the reason the story's in the book is for what he said. He says, I was walking back to the creek, I got my bucket of water, I turned around, and I didn't know where I was. He says that I didn't recognize the country, I didn't see you guys, I yelled, nothing. And I was trying to figure out where I was, and how I got here, I don't even know.
All right, and I wanted to get into, a couple of things here. Have you ever... There's some obvious connections here to, as we said, to old legends and stuff, but it also seems like some of the fairy tales, or I don't want to say fairy legends from Celtic countries and stuff like that, and changeling stories might also be a description of some of this phenomena.
Yeah, and I think that some of those old legends and things are still around for a reason, because I think in those countries, they might have some applicability all over the world.
Yeah, what was I going to say? Oh, there's also the one in Australia, and they actually made a movie on this. And I'm trying to out of the Black Rock National Park, and you mentioned it in the book, but you didn't get too much information. And I think you said you tried to dig up information and couldn't find any.
It was thin. It was hard to come by, but I mean, people need to look at that area and understand. When you talk about boulder fields, it's like the boulder field of all boulder fields.
Yeah, and it's and I can't remember the name of the movie. A listener had actually recommended it to me, and they told a strange tale, but it's hard to say, how much of it was actually based on information they found and how much was just based on hearsay and legend.
Right.
But
and that's the part we try to stay true to, is not trying to work outside the box, but stay within a real confined box of facts and evidence. And it's all right to bring in, fairy tales, myths, legends, because sometimes they help understand that this may be happening in other parts of the world, and there may be a parallel.
Yeah, and it also suggests how far back these tales might actually go.
Absolutely.
And I heard on one show you were talking about an experience you had while hunting where everything got eerily quiet.
Yeah, and every once in a while you hear about this from witnesses, and it's an unexplained phenomena that it's never happened to me before or since, but I was with another friend of mine, and I guess you would say we were bear hunting up in Northern California, even though we've never shot anything. It was more just like a buddy thing to go out, and we were walking along, and I was with this guy who was probably 68, 70 years old, but in phenomenal shape. A real man who knows the woods upside down and sideways, and just knows life well. And as we're walking along, all of a sudden, simultaneously, we stopped and turned towards each other and said, "You realize what's going on?" And we looked around, and it was like a complete vacuum of silence. There was no sound. There was no movement. And we looked up to the top of this Douglas fir tree, probably 400 feet, and you could see it swaying. You couldn't hear any sound. And I said, "Okay, you go to this side of the tree, and you look that way. I'm going to go to this side and look this way, and let's see how long it takes for it to come back." It was several minutes later. All of a sudden, the chipmunks come back. The wind comes back. The normal sounds associated with the forest come back. I can tell you that it was a very, very weird feeling that we both had together at the same time.
And I've had that experience in the woods, and it is definitely a very creepy. It almost reminds me of what Jenny Randall's called the Oz factor.
Explain that for me and the viewers.
Which is when people have UFO experiences, they seem to happen in sort of a altered state of consciousness, or even paranormal experiences where things seem different and things get dead quiet, and it just takes on almost a surreal feel.
And I think that's true for us, because there was some other element there besides just no noise that made us turn around together and recognize it. It was like a sixth sense that we don't regularly understand.
Yeah, something you couldn't necessarily detect, but you were kind of just feeling slightly.
Yep.
And it could just be areas of the earth, like boulder fields and stuff, may also set off like altered state of consciousness.
I would say that, but there's something to these big granite areas. And as I said in the books, that the biggest cluster anywhere in the world that we can identify right now is Yosemite. And there is the biggest mass of granite probably anywhere around that people visit on a regular basis. And then when you think of stories like on Mount Shasta, where a guy named Carl Landers was climbing the mountain with his friends, went around a corner and disappeared where there's no place to disappear to, and never found, none of his equipment's ever found. I remember the state search and rescue coordinator said to me, Dave, he either went in or he went up, but he's not on.
Wow. One of the other things I found interesting is so many of these people are found in whatever state they're found. They're often found near naked or completely naked, but there's never really any sexual abuse or molestation going on.
No. And another unusual part of that is that as people, sometimes thousands of searchers are looking for this person, I would say 95% of the time that clothing is never found. And usually, sometimes they find gloves of search and rescue people, other things that are missing from search and rescue people, but this clothing is never found. What you're going to hear from a lot of people who haven't read the book and are just armchair theorists is that this is something having to do with hypothermia and its condition where people strip their clothes. The problem with that theory is that in many of these cases, the people strip their clothes within that first couple hours, and hypothermia couldn't even have set in yet. Or, as in a couple of these cases, the parent said, my child can't dress or undress themselves. So how they got undressed or how they got their clothes back on backwards, I have no idea.
One of the ones that I found especially strange, and someone who actually had some memory of where she had been, was Linda Arteaga? Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know how you pronounce it. Maybe Arteaga?
Something like that. And she was in Arkansas.
Right. That's one of the more current cases as well. And that was in July of 2012, 53 years old, St. Joe, Arkansas. Before I go a lot further, I will say that Arkansas is one of those states that has some of the strangest disappearances and strangest facts associated with the disappearances of any state in the Union. And Linda qualifies in there. She was with her brother. She came out to visit. They were a mile from Buffalo River National Park, and they decided to look for this fishing hole that her brother knew about. Somehow, and this is what happens, somehow they got separated. She doesn't know how, her brother don't know how, but they searched for her for 5 days. They finally ended up finding her, and they take her to the hospital. And she tells a story that as she was missing, there were people watching her in the bushes. And she would try to talk to them, and they wouldn't respond. And she described them as weird people. And they scared her at times. Now, I probably wouldn't have included that story in the book unless there were other stories that mimic that in other parts of the country that involve women as well. And sometimes women have described being chased through the woods by strange guys or strange men. It's always strange or weird. It's not normal looking or normal men.
Right.
In one case, there was a girl that was hanging clothes in her backyard. She lived way out in the middle of nowhere. And some strange man started chasing her, and she said that she blacked out. She doesn't remember anything else. She remembers waking up next to a lake. Helicopter found her, brought her home. She goes, that's all I remember.
And even that, I mean, could it be that these people are having, like what some people think UFO abduction experiencers have, where they're screen memories, where they're just something that didn't really happen, but they think it happened, and they can't tell the difference?
So one of the things that I think everybody on our team does that many teams of investigators from other criteria don't do is that you hear about cryptozoology researchers, you hear about UFO researchers, you hear about researchers that are maybe paranormal types. Most of these people tend to stay within the confines of their own research area, and they read everything they can about that specific area. Yet we believe from the beginning that this isn't going to be answered by just staying inside the small confines of where we're at. We need to take this wide breadth and really look at all these different things and see what the parallel elements and how they come into play. Now, have you ever read the work of a guy named John Mack?
Yes.
So for the listeners out there, John Mack, PhD out of Harvard. Actually, he was an MD, he's a psychiatrist, a brilliant man, and he started to look into abductions that people claimed were done by aliens, UFOs. And he got into this, and Harvard tried to throw him out of the school. And what he ended up saying was that there seemed to be consistent elements in those stories that aren't publicized, but the people knew, and they would tell the story, and he goes, after hundreds of these, the people couldn't have known what I know, and that's exactly what I apply here to the missing people. There's certain underlying criteria that run through this, just like run through alien abductions, that make these all believable, and there seems to be continuity. Well, when Mack did that, he said, there's certain elements to the abduction that make these highly unusual. And I think that one of those things that he talked about was that somehow or another there's like a memory wash. And when I read that work, I got to say that, that's almost some of the language that was used by investigators on some of these cases involving these people. It's almost like they lost their memory, it was temporarily suspended, there was a suspension of awareness. There was something that went on with these people, whether it was such a traumatizing event that their brain excluded it, or there was some other thing going on that we don't understand.
Okay. And I mean, obviously something's actually going on, whereas you might make the argument that UFO abductions could be altered states of consciousness. I mean, despite some physical evidence, they're light on physical evidence, heavy on experience. People are disappearing, so there's obviously a preponderance of physical evidence and not a lot of personal experience, because most of these people don't remember anything.
Well, there's loads of physical evidence that these people actually were away or were missing, and that coupled with, we just did a look at all of the cases, and I think it's almost 40% of the cases, either law enforcement or the parent come out and state publicly that they feel that their child or their boyfriend or whatever has been kidnapped or was abducted. And the reason being is that the area has been gone through and searched so thoroughly that there's no way that person was still in that area.
Let's look at one of these other strange cases. One of the ones I found that was also, well, they're all weird, as we said, but some of them definitely stand out and have a little bit of a variation to the data. One of those was Betty Waldrum. And this was someone who was missing out of Manitoba and was able to relay some information about where she had been.
Yeah, a 4-year-old little girl. This is an old case. This was from May of 1934, area called Moosehorn, Manitoba. It's about 120 miles northwest of Winnipeg. It's way out in the middle of nowhere. Imagine a very, very lush area, lots of farms, but a lot of overgrowth, a lot of rivers and streams. And Betty was sleeping in a carriage out in front of her house while her parents were seeding some acreage out there on their farm. And they came back and she wasn't there. Now, one of the things that is very strange, we think, is that we have 3 cases where the victims and their family were German. And this is one of those cases where the family spoke predominantly German. And when Betty went missing, the family could speak English, but they somewhat of a difficult time explaining. Well, eventually they got hundreds of people out there looking, and a farmer several miles away told his family that he thought he knew where Betty was going to be located. And he says, you know what? I'm either going to come back beaten up really bad, or I may never come back, but I'm going to bring her back. And he went out, he found her and brought her back, and right away the RCMP were all over him. as though he did it,
Mhm.
but he didn't do it. And they questioned him, and we tried to get this report, but they said that they didn't have it archived because this would be a fascinating interview. Because the man said that he had an idea where this girl was going to be located, and he told the family, and he told RCMP, I may not come back, or I may be so beaten to crap that I may not be able to talk about it, but I'm going to go get this girl, and I'm bringing her in. And he went to the far reaches of his farm, found her, and brought her back. Now, one of the other things that another farmer said at the time where the RCMP came to interview them, the farmer said, well, you know, that's kind of strange because I've had a cow, I don't have a big herd of them, but I've had a cow return in just the last day, and it was milked. And that's never happened before. Now, it's a coincidence that this girl disappears next door. A very, very strange story.
And when she finally could relay the story, she told it to her mother in German, like days later, wasn't it?
Yeah, correct. It was, and I think that German side of things is one of the interesting factors. We don't hear about Spanish speakers, we don't hear about Italians, but German, I think that's unusual.
And this is the one where she met a mother and her child, and they took her in, right?
Supposedly.
Right. Well, that was what she said happened.
Right.
And casually mentioned she had been scratched by a cat as well.
Correct.
And
Now, what kind of invalidates that, or even makes it stranger, is that the roads in these areas, everybody knows a car's coming 5 miles away because they're all dirt. And they even said that all the farmers said, hey, there hasn't been a car on these roads other than us in days because we know when we're coming home, we know when we're leaving. Nobody's been here. Nobody's moved around. So right away, everyone discounted Betty's story and said, oh, you know, she must have been hallucinating. But the reality of it is that just in the same way Ida Mae Curtis talked about a bear grabbing her, and people did see something like that, it's something that has to be thought about and said, well, you know, maybe she had something unusual. And that isn't the first time a missing child has come back and said that somebody has kept them and told and taken care of them and then sent them back.
yeah. And obviously this is one of the common variations as opposed to the variation of people just getting lost when they just can't tell where they are as if they're disoriented. One of the patterns you found here too is that children tend, now according to missing person experts, children should go downhill, and in many of these cases they're found uphill.
Right. And that's not to say that people don't go uphill, but most commonly, say 95% of the time, children take the path of least resistance. And normally, so would we as adults go downhill, and, you know, why climb uphill, especially in inclement weather when you know you're going uphill, the weather's going to get colder, it's going to get worse, you're going to go downhill.
I think one of the good examples is from somewhat locally to here was David Raleigh.
Oh, yes.
If you want to get into that one a little bit.
Sure. He was a 5-year-old boy, went fishing with his brother and his dad. This was in June 13th of 59, and this was about 8 p.m. at night. They were fishing on a lake called Lake Winnisook, and imagine a big mountains surrounding a lake, beautiful area, lush, perfect place to vacation. Well, they fished till late that afternoon. It was David, his brother, and his dad. It started to rain, and his dad pulled the boat into the little pier area and told David, okay, you go run in the cabin, which was within view. And he just had to run around some bushes to get there. And he didn't arrive. And it rained heavy and then started to snow in the mountaintops around that area that night. And we're talking a huge, huge search. It went on for 30 days. There were thousands of people combing the area. Finally, they came back multiple times. And on October 3rd of that same year, his dad and another, I think it was a captain from the state troopers, they found his body 900 feet up the mountain in a little like Creek Gully, and the coroner said he died of exposure the first night. That was their verdict. Now let me tell you, I don't believe that in any stretch of the imagination that a coroner could say, oh yeah, that happened the night of June 13th when it was 4 months ago. I have a difficult time with that one. And I think that's one way of the medical examiner maybe giving peace to the family, but 900 feet up the mountain, there isn't the wildest stretch of anyone's imagination that David Raleigh thought that that was the location of the cabin.
And it's not something like to be that disoriented to climb up a hill. I mean, that's not a normal level of disorientation, if that was even how he got up there.
Oh yeah, and I mean that's just one story about a small boy or a small girl getting up into the upper reaches of beyond rational thought. I mean, there's a case of David Scott just outside the boundary of Yosemite National Park, was vacationing with his family. He was 2 or 3 years old. He disappeared around a lake, and this family was smart, and they knew right away. They said, hey, don't even be looking right around here. He's not here. He either drove away with somebody and got kidnapped, or there's something really strange going on, because our son wouldn't do that. Eventually, they ended up tracking this boy up this mountain on the lake, near the lake, and he went up one mountain, down that mountain, and up the other side, over 3,000 feet in elevation. And they found his body laying on the backside of a boulder, and a soldier that found him was interviewed later on, and he was asked, was there any injury to the body? And he says, you got to talk to the coroner about that. So how he got up 3,000 feet, I have no idea.
Wow. Has anyone brought in like psychics or anything to investigate any of these missing disappearances?
You know, in the Martin case, there were psychic reports in there, and some of them were really strange. One of them came at the time from a pretty world-famous psychic who said that his mind had a difficult time seeing what it was believing, and he had a difficult time even talking about it, but he wanted the Park Service to call him because the darkness that came over him when he thought of this, he had a difficult time staying there. It was one of the darkest, most disturbing psychic reports I've ever seen.
Okay. I think all of this stuff, to some degree, qualifies as disturbing. What is one of the things I was wondering? Has anyone really big, like heavy, been abducted?
There's been a couple of farmers that have disappeared that were big people, and they were described as a family as large. And that was one of the things that the family even said, like, my dad can't go that far. Or, you know, there have been people, there was a man in Yosemite that he wasn't that big, but he was disabled. And even the park superintendent, when they asked him what happened to this man, said, we have no idea. This is the most disturbing case I've ever been involved in. We have no idea where he went because he couldn't travel long distances. He was injured.
One of the things you talk about in the new book is some legends from Indonesia, and a particular case, I believe. And I think Whitley Strieber had something to do with you finding out about this.
What happened was Whitley actually wrote the back cover of that latest book, and he's been a big advocate. He said, Dave, the things that you've brought out, people don't understand, but there is something huge here. And what he ended up doing is he was communicating with a person that I think they were a UK citizen living in Indonesia, and they were hearing about people in the jungle that were disappearing. And if they were bright colors, it tended to be a trigger point for the disappearance. That's what the locals said. And there weren't any names associated with this other than the guy named some specifics regarding areas in Indonesia where this occurred. And Whitley had validated some of this information and said, what they're talking about is something that I talk about in the books, and that is bright colors seem to be worn by the people in an inordinate amount of the time.
And wasn't there also another story about them walking into, maybe Whitley told the story, but them people walking and ending up somewhere where they didn't know where they were anymore?
Oh yeah, well that's definitely something that I would have agreed with, and that happens, but I don't remember hearing it.
Oh, okay, all right. It might have been Whitley then who was talking about it. What are some of the theories that people have that might actually fit this, even if they're a little bit, say, paranormal? I mean, a lot of people immediately jump to aliens, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of, like, UFO activity around these disappearances or anything.
Right. And I would say that I've been approached with everything under the sky. And I mean, when I first got into this, I've never even heard of this, and that's reptilians. People have said, "Oh yeah, this is obviously the reptilians grabbing these people." I'm a little unclear because I sent him back a polite response, and I said, "Well, can you point me to somebody who's either interacted or seen one?" And they couldn't. So I'm not sure what it is really, other than it's supposed to be some kind of reptilian creature that's on Earth. I don't know.
Right.
And then I've probably had 100 responses about UFOs and aliens. I've had an equal number of responses for some type of crypto creature, and an equal number of responses for its obvious. And I think this comes from people who haven't read the books, is that it's a serial killer in the woods, and obviously the Park Service is trying to cover it up. And I said right away, this is not happening. This is not a human-type disappearance. It's caused by a human.
And if that were the case, there would have to be quite a lot of serial killers, and they must either live a long time or be passing it through their family.
Yeah, they'd be really old.
and really good at this to have never been caught.
And there's a point right there that I'll talk about. And this is a strange point that actually one of our guys brought up when we were talking. And that is that if you can imagine this, whatever is happening here, if there is an outside entity involved, they have a 100% success rate.
Are there any records of, like, cattle mutilations near any of these clusters?
That's probably a good question, because I don't know a lot about cattle mutilations, but I know Montana and Wyoming have had them, and parts of Colorado had them. But usually those are in areas that are maybe flatter, not as much coverage, not as much force. But truthfully, we haven't spent a lot of time trying to draw those two together.
Okay. Could some of these disappearances be happening in cities on a similar level that we just don't notice because they're in a city and they don't stand out as suspicious?
One of the things when we started to go through these cases, we obviously purposely eliminated any type of urban disappearance. And the reason for that is that there's so much opportunity in an urban environment for someone to disappear, either voluntarily, involuntarily, commit suicide, drown, get buried. You hear about these stories of people buried under Yankee Stadium, or there's all kinds of ways to disappear.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lot easier to bring in that human element to those type of disappearances. But along those lines, while we are researching disappearances, there are some very, very strange stories from the early 1900s, late 1800s, from New York and New Jersey area about children that seemed to vanish on a corner, and then they were never found. We didn't document them, but we just happened to cross them, and they are strange, they are weird, but I think the first place everyone's going to go is, it's just a pedophile, it's a serial killer.
Right. A couple of the weird stories from Montana that I wanted you to relate to people. First one's William Carmack, and that actually involved two missing people.
Yeah, and that does happen occasionally, and I wrote about two people simultaneously in the latest book, but Carmack's case is one of those guys, William Carmack, he's 55 years old. He's like the grizzled mountain man that you would visualize in your mind, and he was taking a pack train back into the mountains of Montana to up a sheep ranch or a sheep herd that was grazing in this lonely stretch of nowhere. And on his way back in there with this five load of mules and things, something happened. And that was on July 22nd, 59. Well, as Carmack was disappearing, a guy named Joe Servell, who was the head of the sheep camp and the lone sheep herder at that location, he disappears. And the strange thing is that they ended up finding Carmack's loads strewn over about 2 miles of trail, 15 miles in from where he originally left from. And this 2-mile stretch of ridgeline was just littered with stuff along it. And they ended up finding one of his horses tied to a tree purposely. A few of the other mules and things were strewn around alive. And they found his gun, like somebody threw the gun into the dirt, and it was still standing upright. And Carmack, they say, died of natural causes. They ended up finding him. They ended up finding Servell a couple days later, barefoot and walking semi-conscious. And there's another element. If the people are found, they're in this grazed, dazed, kind of half asleep, half awake, and that's the way Servell was. And when they ended up coming to, they asked him what happened. He didn't even know. He couldn't explain it.
All right, well, the other one out of Montana was Robert Springfield, and this is someone whose remains were found, and the status of those remains and his belongings is what makes it very, very strange.
Yeah, and that's a good question about his remains. And it was September '04. He's 49 years old. He's hunting the Crow Indian Reservation in Montana with his two sons. They were elk hunting, bow and arrow, and his sons were trying to move the elk down into a valley he was hunting in. He ended up disappearing. Big search. Nothing was ever found of him up until October 2005. Another hunter, now remember, this is called the Crow Indian Reservation. In October 2005, another hunter is hunting, walking along. He hears a screeching crow in a tree, and it's going nonstop right at him. So he looks at it, and he follows it to the tree where the crow's at. And at the bottom of the tree, they find a partial skull, a femur, a belt that's rolled up, a wallet, and some other minor things. And it turns out those were the remains of Robert Springfield and a few of his personal effects. The bow and arrow were never found. Because it happened on an Indian reservation and the FBI is the primary authority there, they took custody of the skull and the bones and the property. Years later, the family kept asking for the parts to come back to the family. FBI wouldn't do it. The family and the Indian reservation finally had to get an attorney and sue the FBI in federal court to get the body parts and the evidence back. My question is, why would the FBI not want to give those back?
Well, why? I guess it seems odd, in relation to that, why the Park Service doesn't want more work done on this. Why, I mean, obviously they don't want the bad publicity that people are disappearing. They can't explain why, but it seems like they'd be doing more to figure out what's going on. And maybe they are, and they're just not telling us.
Well, here's an interesting story. Just not too long ago, a friend and I were in a national park, and we happened to go into a small office that they have in this remote location, and there were a couple of retired park rangers and full-duty park rangers standing inside, and I just sat there with my friend and we listened. Turns out one of the guys sitting there was a retired special agent from the Park Service. So I went out to the parking lot, and we're waiting for this guy to come out because I want to talk to him. And he comes out, and we ended up having this really interesting conversation with this man. And I explained who I was and what I was doing and the problems I was having with the Park Service. And he said, David, you gotta remember something. He goes, they want to keep this Smokey the Bear attitude. Ho-dee-ho-dee-do, everything's good in the park, nothing's wrong. And he said that they lack integrity at times. And he said, sometimes they just don't do the right thing. And he says it's true. They don't have any of these lists of missing people. And when we asked the Park Service under a Freedom of Information Act request for a list of missing people from the system, they said they didn't have one. He goes, I believe that's true. And he says it's complete. It's just ineptitude. You know, how tough can it be to have a list at every park of people that are missing? A piece of binder paper with a couple of columns, and you have one. It's not rocket science. But maybe, you know, that list, they don't want you to know how many people are missing. We don't know. But the Park Service, when I asked them for that, under an FOIA, they said, no, we don't have any. And I says, well, I've written a couple of books, so I want an author's exemption, but I want the information. And they said, well, we're not going to abide by your author's exemption because your books aren't in enough libraries. And there's no such requirement anywhere in FOIA for that. You just have to be a published author, and a publishing house published my books. So, but they excluded that, and they wouldn't do it. And they said, but if you want that information, come up with $1.4 million, and we'll give it to you.
And what was the $1.4 million supposed to be for?
For them to do their job. Have a list of missing people in their system. See, there's a requirement that if you're a child and you go missing, that they have to enter you inside of the National Center for Exploited Children database. But almost every law enforcement agency you can imagine, if a child disappeared in the 1980s, they're still going to be entered in that database, even though the requirement isn't until, I think, 86. Everything after 86 has to be in. Well, the Park Service doesn't enter the kids in that were missing before then and have never been found. And when they want you off their books, and they don't want to ever talk about it again, they use this classification called missing presumed dead. And then you're not missing anymore. You're dead.
Has anyone tried to do any profiling work on the people who are abducted to see if there's any other patterns that emerge?
Well, this is, that's a lot of what we've done here, is that profile of the person who's disappeared. And if you, like these elements we talked about, that's a lot of what a profiler will do. And in the books I talk about how the FBI is on scene at a lot of these disappearances. And then the agency just says, well, they're monitoring the event. Well, for the people that don't know, the FBI are the utmost professionals at documentation because they're all very well educated and they're very well trained. And all those reports go back to the profiling center in Virginia, and a profiler reads all these reports. And what they're looking for is exactly what I'm looking for in these reports, parallels. And if they can find them, then they know a serial event is occurring. And so that is a lot of what they're doing. And I say in the books, the FBI is not stupid. All these disappearances, especially in the Smoky Mountains, where it was the same FBI agent time after time going into the same sort of event time after time, they know something unusual is going on. That's why he's there.
And don't you have a story about one of these FBI agents?
Well, that was the FBI agent that was on the Martin case and was on just about every other disappearance during that time in the Great Smoky Mountains, in and outside the park. And this agent wrote a lot of reports. He was the spokesperson for the agency on a lot of these cases. And this is what happened. Dennis Martin's dad refused to talk to the press all these years because he feels he's been lied to, and he hates the press. And one day I was with another investigator out in Tennessee, and I said, you know what? We're going to go knock on Mr. Martin's door, and we're going to ask him a few questions, and I hope he talks to us. I went up. He's living in the same house he was when Dennis disappeared, the same address. knocked on the door. He came to the door. I recognized him. He's an older man now, but he looks the same. And I explained who I was, and he said, David, he goes, this has cast a huge shadow over my life, my wife's life, and we talked about it years ago that we wouldn't talk about it anymore. I explained I'd come from California. I probably know more about your case than anybody else. Can I just have 10 minutes of your time? He stepped outside and he started to talk. And he said, the press lied to me then. They've lied to me since. They won't tell the truth to the public about what happened. They won't admonish what they did, what was wrong. And I don't trust many people, David. And I explained to him what I knew, and I asked him, I said, one of the things I ask every victim, no matter what kind of crime it is what does the public need to know, or what do I need to know that was never publicized? And he says, well, the Key family observation when they saw something on that hill. I said, yeah. He says, well, do you know that the Key family saw that whatever this thing was, it had something on its shoulder? And I said, you're kidding. And he says, no. But they wouldn't put that in the newspaper, and they never put it in any report. Well, later on, I went back to the head tracker for the Park Service with that information, and I asked him if it was true. He said it was true. He goes, they buried that information. The press would never talk about it, and the Park Service would never talk about it. One other thing, and I said, well, what else is there that the public needs to know that's been buried about this? And he says, well, the FBI agent that was on my son's case, that was on the rest of these cases all over the Smoky Mountains. I said, oh, yeah, and I named him. And he says, well, he committed suicide. I said, I didn't know that. The investigator I was with went back, tracked down a retired agent out there, and confirmed that he did commit suicide.
Wow. And, of course, there's no way to know for sure if that was related to this, but that's definitely a possibility.
I don't think there's one element in any of these cases that really stands out as the aw shucks moment. I think it's everything in its totality points to, especially in the Martin case, points to the press in Knoxville being absolutely corrupt and worthless.
Yeah.
And my point to that being is that right before the books came out, we held a press conference in Knoxville, and every NBC, ABC, CBS, and Fox came out. The room was packed. And we had charts, we had every names, dates, locations. Do you know nothing about that event was ever shown on the news? And one guy from one station came up to us afterwards and said, God, guys, that is a stellar presentation. Are you never going to see any of this on the news? And I said, you're kidding. And he says, no, I wish I could, but he goes, my station manager never would let us. I said, why is that? He says, because the primary generator for this whole area is the park. That's what generates the income for this entire area. We need the visitors. We can't have bad press.
And, from that standpoint, it makes sense, but it's not right.
Imagine you were Mr. Martin, and you had things held from you. When you looked towards that governmental agency that was supposed to be assisting you, supposed to be that pure place, the National Park Service, Smokey the Bear, wear the big hats, do the right thing. They didn't.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time to go over one more case. And I think probably the strangest story anyone told coming back from this would have been John Doe, whose name you kept, in the third book. And this happened on Mount Shasta, where all kinds of strange stories have been coming out of for years. Do you want to get into a little of that and what he said happened to him when he was returned?
So this is a fairly new case, October of 2010, and this was in the shadow of Mount Shasta. Little boy was there with his parents, camping on a river that I have fished on many, many times. It's a gorgeous area, very thick. I mean, there's actors, big-time actors in Hollywood that own huge tracts of land right in this area because it's so gorgeous. And this boy got lost sometime in the late afternoon, and nobody could understand where he went. And maybe they thought that he went in this river, but the river's not very big. And Make a long story short, at 11:30 that same night, he's found hiding in this, or laying in this bush, semi-conscious, and his parents pick him up, and the next day his grandmother sees him, and he goes, "Hey, Grammy, I just saw you," or "I saw some, I just saw you," and he gives this story about waking up in a cave while he was disappeared. And a woman who was being pretty nice to him looked just like his grandma, her. And he said that this woman had a lot of robots in this cave, and there was a bright light coming from one part of the cave where you had to take this ladder to go out. And he said that they talked for a while, and then this woman pulls out a piece of what he thought was paper and lays it on the ground, and told the boy, "You have to go poo on the paper." And he said, "Well, I don't have to go poo." And she goes, "You have to go poo." "I don't have to go." So she got mad, and then the next thing he realizes is he's back up on this trail under this bush. And the grandmother told me that what's really strange about this is that 2 weeks before this event, at that same location, she was camping with a boyfriend of hers. And she woke up in the morning with a pain in her neck and asked her boyfriend to look at her neck, and she had a spot of blood like right over the spine. And she says, I don't want to directly say one's related to the other, but that's kind of coincidental, and that's kind of strange. How could I say that's not strange? That's really strange.
Yeah. Oh, and of course you have to take the boy's word that the boy is probably not making it up, because it's not something that he's going to make up. It doesn't necessarily mean it actually happened that way, but it seems like his memories are probably honestly relayed.
I wish I had the opportunity to get face-to-face with the boy and talk to him. I didn't. This came through a relative, but yeah, it's hard to say, because sometimes, as investigators or detectives out there know, a child's perception can be clouded or made cloudy or even changed by the way the person's talking to them, or the way they subliminally change their minds by the way the questioning pursues.
Sure.
And I don't know any of that, but I can tell you that it's very strange.